Welcome into Walker Talks Radio. It's a Wednesday morning. I'm not normally recording this early on a weekday, but I like it. It's different. Seeing the light outside the windows gives me a little bit of energy, although the heat in West Tennessee right now is pretty suffocating. This conversation that I'm about to have with Chloe Akers has been a year in the making, I believe. Right, Chloe? I think that's
I think
about a
it's been
year ago we made
a
initial
full year.
contact.
Yes.
I remember getting your message in my LinkedIn inbox. It was after an article I wrote for Tennessee Lookout, and I believe it was about the gun violence problem in Tennessee and maybe the lack of legislation, the lack of anything being done about it. And to me, that was such a common sense issue. And through our messaging, I think we realized that we were standing on the same common ground as a lot of Tennesseans. And I think a year down the road, present day 2024, a lot of Americans, especially after the debate last week, we're all just sitting here wondering, like, this can't be the best political situation we can find ourselves in on a state level, on a national level. And it also increasingly feels like a lot of these polarizing narratives are creeping down into local politics now as well. I know we're seeing that here in West Tennessee. So this, as we kind of talked about the other day on the phone, this is almost a perfect time to finally be having this conversation, even though we started the process a year ago. We're now ready to have the actual conversation, and I think it's very, very timely. So thank you for joining me, and I want to hear a little bit about you as a person before we dive into what the Best of Tennessee is all about, because this is a group that you've recently started, but a year ago you were on this pathway. So I'm going to kind of throw it to you, let you tell everyone a little bit about yourself personally, and then jump right into how you got involved in this arena.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me. So I'm maybe the last person who ever thought I would be sitting here having this conversation with you, working in politics in any way. I am a fifth generation East Tennessean, East Tennessee native from Knoxville, grew up between Knoxville and Florida. Parents got divorced. Went to college at Cornell University, came home and went to law school at UT. I was a practicing criminal defense lawyer for 14 years. Right up, went to college, law school, started practicing. I was always a criminal defense attorney, never did anything else. I loved being an advocate. I loved working with my clients. I was a state and federal public defender for 10 years. And then I was in private practice for, about 4 after that. So I was happy, living my best life, working as a trial attorney. I think it's important my brain works in terms of functionality, not ideology. And I didn't really understand how important this was to the current work that I do now until I kind of got into it, right? When you're a criminal defense lawyer, when you are standing next to a person who's been charged with a crime and they are relying on you to do your job, that client doesn't really, and rightfully so, they don't care what you feel, what your ideology is, they care about whether you are capable, whether you understand the functionality of the law, whether you can understand the evidence at hand. So that's kind of how my brain works. So I was like minding my business as a criminal lawyer in June of 2022, when something really pivotal happened in my life and in the lives of so many other Americans, which is the Dobbs decision. So I read the Dobbs decision on a Friday in my office as a lawyer. I immediately, that functionality part of my brain shifted into gear. And I thought, well, this Supreme Court decision returned the issue of abortion to the states. I understand Tennessee has a new abortion law that's going to go into effect. I understand it's a criminal law. I'm a criminal lawyer. I should read it. I read the law and I was really struck by the breadth and scope of the legislation. And I was struck not from a place necessarily of ideology and the way I felt about it. I was struck based on its lack of functionality and practice, because as a criminal lawyer, I knew instantly that this law was poorly drafted, very, very vague and ambiguous, was likely going to cause some serious concerns for women, for patients, for doctors, for nurses, for a variety of reasons that had nothing to do with the ideology of how somebody felt about abortion. So long story short, Gabe, I made an Instagram video because I thought that if I didn't know what the law in Tennessee said and how it might function prior to that moment, I had a feeling other people didn't either. And I thought maybe 5 or 6 people would see the video. I had a private account at the time because as a criminal defense lawyer, we're not always the most popular people. So I had a private account. I made a video. I thought a few folks would see it. They did. They asked me if they could share my video. They said this was really helpful for me to understand kind of the situation that we're in. And what was striking, Gabe, is that the group of friends that I have in my life are very diverse politically. I'm from Knoxville. I live in Nashville now, but I did not surround myself with people who saw the world the same way I did. And so friends from various political backgrounds all asked to share the video, which I think was interesting. And so I said, sure. So I made my profile public. And then in a couple weeks, 2 million people saw the video. And that totally changed the trajectory of my life. And it started me down this path of realizing there was a really strong appetite in this state and elsewhere in this country for information that was based not in overly divisive ideology, but in functionality and practice and honesty and authenticity. And so I started making videos about the Tennessee abortion ban, not from a place of when does life begin or whether your views are this way or that way, or, I steered intentionally away from sowing greater division in the issue and tried to explain the law in very practical terms in ways that allowed people to make their own choices and to make their own decisions about how they felt about the law, but in a way that was meeting them where they were. And so that's kind of how I ended up here.
Before we go further, I'm just curious personally, what were those issues in the way the law was written that you as a defense attorney, you immediately were like, oh, this isn't written well. This is going to cause a lot of issues for a lot of people. Like, are there some highlights that you
Sure.
can just throw out there to the public to say, hey, this is what I saw and this is why it was written poorly?
Sure. I mean, I think that number one, when the law was initially enacted, it had an affirmative defense instead of any exceptions. We now have exceptions in our law, but they're so vaguely drafted that they're really difficult, if not entirely impossible, to carve out and comply with. So what I mean by that is, as it stands now under the current law, as it was amended, terminating a pregnancy is not considered a crime if it is necessary to prevent death. But the language necessary to prevent death is not defined. And so that leaves physicians and healthcare providers in a really, unfortunate position where they have to weigh their liberty interest against the care for their patient. And kind of what I mean by that is, if a patient comes into the hospital with a life-threatening emergency that termination would treat and is the appropriate, standard of care, the doctor and the hospital staff is left wondering, well, is the patient close enough to death for this procedure to be necessary? What does necessary mean? And so I think that when you have vagueness and ambiguity in any law, especially around what makes it criminal or not. So when you have laws where sometimes it's a crime and sometimes it's not, and the thing that makes it a crime or not is vaguely defined, no matter what the subject matter, that's poorly written, because it creates a situation where it's very, very difficult for people to know how to comply with the law and stay on the right side of the law. And that most people are interested in not breaking law. So it's particularly troublesome when the subject matter is healthcare. And you're dealing with situations of termination or of complications from pregnancy, which, as I've learned, can go from manageable to terminal very quickly. And so the hesitation that is caused by the ambiguity is a concern for many, many, many healthcare professionals, rightfully so. And again, I don't think any of this has to do with ideology or a person's politics or view on abortion. I think it's really just having an honest conversation about the way that the law is drafted and how it might impact people along the way.
For sure. And I think those are the things, and we'll get into some more of these topics that are lightning rod topics that it's so difficult to talk about, because as soon as you bring up the subject matter, people have already taken sides already. Like, there's just hardly any middle ground. I think abortion is one of those conversations, which even reframing it as, and not even reframing because it is healthcare. So I shouldn't say reframing, because that's what this is as well. It's a healthcare issue. But too many times I think people, when they hear that word, they automatically just freeze up and they're not going to listen to another side. So it is, and I think guns are the same way in Tennessee. It's very hard to have an honest conversation about gun violence in Tennessee without one group saying we got to get rid of all guns and the other group saying, well, you're not going to have any of my semi-automatic weapons ever. So there's common ground to be found, but it's so hard to get there. So after you made this video and it went viral, were you prepared for all of the attention that you got from that? And what was that transition like, moving from practicing law into this area of politics, for lack of a better
No,
word?
I was not at all prepared for the attention that came after the first video and then has continued in the months and years since. I had no earthly idea that video would be seen by so many people. As I tell everyone, my biggest regret is that I was chewing gum when I made that video. And both of my grandmothers are still rolling in their graves over it. So no, I had no idea. I had no idea what to expect. I wasn't prepared. I think, what's really interesting that you just said that I think is a nice segue into the best of Tennessee is, one of the things that I noticed when I was talking about abortion was that the way that the conversation was framed was such that one side of the debate believed it was a human right, and the other side of the debate believes it's murder. And when you frame an issue such that it's either a human right or murder, there is no place in the conversation for anyone who might see the subject matter in more shades of gray, with more complexity. And I think that what we learned post Dobbs and what I learned myself is when you take a topic that went from theoretical to very practical and kind of an instant, you realize that this is an extraordinarily complex subject matter, that most people in this state of Tennessee and in this country have very complicated, complex views on this subject. And until we reframe the conversation to allow them a place at the table to interact, we're missing out on having a more meaningful discussion. And I think that framework is so similar to and sort of illustrates on a smaller policy level what we're seeing in politics more generally, right? You have each side, each party believes, based on at least all of the fundraising emails I continually get every day, you see both parties saying the other party is a threat to democracy. If you want a better Tennessee or you want a better America, you need to vote for this party and not the other. You've created, politics has created this framework for discussion where you are either or, there is no yes and, that both parties believe the other is a direct threat to democracy and our way of life. And they believe, what I'm seeing is they believe it based on the party. Not that there may be an individual politician within the other party that is, a threat to democracy, just the whole party. So when you frame an issue like that and you make politics so either or instead of yes and, ironically, in the same way that you see it unfold with the abortion discussion, you leave out everyone in the middle. If you have a more complex view of politics, if you think, I sort of agree with some of the points that the left is making, sort of see some of the points that the right's making, I have complex views, I'm not a monolithic voter, no one is, where do you stand? Where do you exist in politics? And I think that's kind of what's gotten me to this point, is understanding that I saw a need to engage with folks around the issue of abortion in a way that allowed for more complexity in the conversation. And in learning how to do that and in trying to understand how to equip more people to be engaged, it led me ultimately here. Because it's not just limited to one policy issue. We have a framework of politics that is so divisive that it precludes any complexity. And I think what we realize as human beings is we are all complex. I have friends all over the place that run the gamut in their approach to politics, but that's not reflected in our government. In our government, it's a complete either or, and everyone is so seemingly entrenched in their tribal camp that it makes it almost impossible for our lawmakers to work together. Because
Yeah,
my
and
goodness,
go ahead.
how are lawmakers supposed to interact with one another when they're framing the other party as a threat to the way of life? Like, how, you that doesn't work. And I think it precludes really talented, thoughtful, reasonable leaders from doing what I believe they know is right and from finding that common ground because it is so polarized.
I want to ask you a couple of questions, and this is just your personal take on this. But the first one is this: how involved or how much attention did you pay to politics before this? Like, were you sort of like casually following it, or were you pretty much like you knew exactly what was going on all the time and couldn't wait to vote in every election, or were you just sort of a casual follower?
I mean, I voted, and I think I've definitely voted in every presidential election. I've voted a lot in Tennessee's primaries. Pretty consistent voter. My first presidential election was 2000 Bush v. Gore, and I voted in South Florida in a hanging Chad district. So I voted in every presidential election since I was 18. Look, I followed politics, certainly. I was more concerned and more interested in following Supreme Court decisions because as a criminal defense lawyer, so many decisions that the United States Supreme Court, renders are actually paramount to my practice at the time. So yeah, I mean, I would consider myself previous to this work, definitely followed politics, was interested, was curious. I did not follow state politics to anywhere close to the degree I do now. I mean, I think I consider myself like most Tennesseans. I was aware and I was concerned and I was definitely educated, but it wasn't totally top of mind for me at the state level until the last couple of years.
The follow up question is, so you and I, that was my first election to vote in as well, 2000,
Oh,
Gore Bush. It was the only time I voted for a Republican president. I was still in college at a super conservative Southern Baptist University in my hometown. That's just what I was expected to do, so I did it. I didn't start, I think, making my own decisions about what I believed politically until probably around 2002, 2003. Surrounding the Iraq War, all of those things that were like, wait a second, do we really need to be doing that? I got very involved and started keeping up then. And since then, I've followed it very closely. That being said, I can remember in 2004 where people were saying, oh man, this is getting really polarized. And then when President Obama was elected in 2008, they're like, well, this is really getting polarized. I long for those days of 2008 and 2004 right now politically, because it seems like we have gotten to a point, everything that you just said for the last 10 minutes, like how do we pull ourselves back from these extremes? Because you can't even, I consider myself probably center left, maybe middle left. Even when I question the nomination of President Biden or his running again for 4 more years, when I publicly question something like that on social media, I've got friends who would say they align themselves with me politically, who I don't want to say attack, but they jumped all over me for just simply suggesting that, hey, this person may not be the best to run an election right now. Like, this is just like, are we not watching the same things? But the vitriol that both sides get, almost like they eat their own when someone dares to speak up. So pragmatically, I'll ask you, with what you're doing with the best of Tennessee, pragmatically, how do we get to move back to the middle? Is it just one-on-one conversations, or like, is there a bigger idea at play here?
well, listen, Gabe, I've spent, my team and I, we've spent a good solid year and a half trying to think about this stuff. So, I mean, look, this is the question, right? How do you do it? And I think that what we're trying to do at the Best of Tennessee is taking a really holistic approach to this. We're looking at a long game. We're looking at a decade, if not more, worth of effort. And so the way we see this is, and what we're doing that's really different, is I think that we're coming at this problem not from the right or the left, but from the middle, which makes this very disruptive to the status quo. What we're attempting to do with the Best of Tennessee long term is to say, look, over the next 10 years, we want to be a part of helping to elect and re-elect 20 to 40 great leaders of both parties that are thoughtful, that are reasonable, that value communication and collaboration, and that reflect back to Tennesseans what we see in our daily lives, which is that embrace of complexity, that embrace of the world is certainly a complex, uncertain time. And sometimes I don't have all of the answers. Sometimes somebody from another party just might. And really working to achieve that long-term goal. And the way we see getting there is sort of a stairway approach, right? Step one, we need to engage a broader, more diverse group of people in the primary elections. If we can show that we're able to mobilize and motivate more folks from the middle to engage in primaries, guess what that helps us do in 2025? It helps us in our pursuit to recruit great candidates, because sometimes you find that wonderful people in your community, again, from both parties, this isn't a one party problem. You may find that wonderful people in your community who would make an excellent leader say, listen, I'd love to run, but I can't win a primary because I'm not right enough or I'm not left enough. Well, we hope to be able to show, no, you can. Look, we're able to increase and diversify the base of voters who show up in a primary. So that will help recruit great candidates. And when you have great candidates who are running, you get increased competition in a two-party system. Increased competition leads to a better electorate, right? So we look at that as kind of a stairway approach. And I think that when you come at this from the center and you really meet people where they are and you say to folks, look, we get it. I hear all the time, you can't both sides extremism. And the type of extremism that we're talking about at the Best of Tennessee is not extremism in policy, because what is extreme for one person may not be for another. That's a completely subjective evaluation. The type of extremism we're talking about that I do think is equally applicable to both sides is an extreme approach to governing that leaves out any opportunity for common ground. That is what I believe distinguishes our attempt to solve this problem, that makes this really unique and really new. What we're saying is, anytime you have a two-party system that has become so entrenched in its own belief that it is the only righteous way to go, that is an extreme approach to government. Okay, because it precludes communication and collaboration, which are key functions to a democracy. So we want to reel that back by promoting this framework of thinking about politics less from a place of whose policy is better or what, there's a million other policy organizations out there that'll tell you which way the wind's blowing on policy. We're really attempting to shift the culture and reframe the conversation in a way that brings those middle voters back to the table, that offers them a place at the table, that broadens and diversifies an electorate to help ensure that folks from that group who embrace that complexity and leadership, if they want to run, can get elected. And we start to create a more virtuous cycle as opposed to a really, sort of disenfranchising cycle of polarization. And so that's our approach. And it is truly, Gabe, it is disruptive. It is disruptive to a status quo that is built around all or nothing politics, because right now it's a zero-sum game. That's how these conversations are framed. That is how there is this approach to government that is all or nothing. And when you create an opportunity to shake that up a little bit, sometimes I joke, I feel like what it might have been to be like Uber, dealing with the taxi drivers. It's like when you come in and you're saying, hey, there might be a different way to do this. It's not always met with open arms, but I think it could be an opportunity to start to erode the polarization, allow the lawmakers in both parties that are currently in office to start to tiptoe toward that common ground. While also creating additional competition and making sure that we have great candidates running in the primary and in general elections.
And that was going to be my next question, and I'm going to lead into it by just sort of giving an observation. From my perspective in following state level politics very closely for the last 4 years, really since COVID, because I was more of a national political guy, right? Like that was all the cool narratives are at the national level. Well, I started focusing a lot more on local and state level around COVID, and what I'm seeing from my perspective is, and maybe this is wishful thinking, I don't know that every elected official individually or personally is that, and I'm going to use the word extreme, that extreme in their thinking. However, they know that they've got to run on platforms and communicate to their base that they're not a rhino or whatever. Like they are a true conservative Republican. And I'm using that party because that's the supermajority in Tennessee. And I've sat down with Republican lawmakers, and in one-on-one conversations, they are open, they are listening, they are agreeable with some of the things that I push back on. But then when they go to session, they just vote right along those lines. But I'm like, wait a second, individually, we had a great conversation. Like you understood me, you agreed with some of those things, but then in the end, you still voted along those lines on a piece of legislation that, in my opinion, was maybe performative, or I don't use the word asinine, that's too strong. But as an educator, there's been a lot of educational legislation that's been voted on that just doesn't make any sense. So how do we, well, here's my question. Is the best of Tennessee, have you guys engaged any current lawmakers in these conversations? Or is it just potential voters at this point?
We're looking at voters at this point.
Okay.
And I think that, one of the things that we recognize is the natural incentive structure for all lawmakers in a democracy, in a representative democracy, so certainly lawmakers in Tennessee, is there is a natural incentive to want to be elected and reelected. In order to be elected and reelected, lawmakers need to please the group of people who have the power to elect and reelect them. In Tennessee, the general elections are largely uncompetitive. Okay, over the last decade, you had, I think, somewhere in the ballpark of about 483 contested elections in the general. You had 11% of those over a decade that were decided by less than 10 percentage points. So what that means is the general election in Tennessee is largely determinative of, is not usually determinative of who wins. What's determinative of who gets the seat is the primary election. And when you also understand that in 2020, for example, we had one of the highest voter turnouts in the general. 69% of registered voters in Tennessee cast a ballot in the 2020 general. However, only 22% of registered voters cast a ballot in the 2020 August 1st primaries. So you have to understand both of those things, I think, and then we can get to your statement. Lawmakers understand that the folks who have the power to elect and reelect them in Tennessee are the primary voters, because the general election is largely uncompetitive. We know from data and from studies across the country that the folks who tend to vote in the primaries tend to be, on both parties, the most ideologically entrenched, right? The middle doesn't tend to show up to primaries. So when you understand, okay, as a lawmaker, what group of folks have the power to elect you and reelect you? It's the 22% that shows up to the primary, not the 69% that shows up to the general. So our strategy, first and foremost, is to broaden the base of people who show up to the primary. Because all of a sudden, if you have a broad and diverse group showing up to the primary that represents more than just the most ideologically entrenched portions of a party, you create an incentive structure for the lawmakers to say, hey, if I want to get reelected, I need to promote policy that my base supports. And my base, by virtue of growing and being diversified, is no longer limited to a fringe. Now it's limited to a bigger group of people, or it expands to a bigger group of people, which means there's more latitude in the incentive structure for lawmakers to work with other lawmakers and to find more common ground. And I think, I've heard a common criticism. Folks have said, well, everybody just votes on party lines in Tennessee. To which I say, I think it's fascinating what we saw this session with vouchers. No, you did not see everybody voting on party lines all the time. Why? I believe it's partly due to the fact that that is an issue that is very much related to the voters in the primary, that base of voters. And so to me, it creates a situation where when you make an issue relevant to the primary base, and lawmakers, I think, are going to do what their constituents want them to do. And we saw that with the issue of school vouchers. You saw this breakdown that you hadn't seen before. You saw folks that were not voting with their party. And I think that had to do in part because that group of people that have the power to elect or reelect them, the primary kind of base voter, felt differently on that particular issue. And I think that you saw. And I say kind of a breakdown, but I think it was actually a really great illustration of democracy, where you saw lawmakers from both parties saying, hey, this isn't what my district wants. Whether it was for or against this divisive issue, you started to see more of that localized individual representation. And I think we need to start to see more of it. And so from our perspective, broadening and diversifying that base shifts the incentive structure. And when you shift the incentive structure to be more reflective of the majority of a district instead of the fringe, you start to see more collaboration and communication among lawmakers. I mean, look, I think there's great people that are currently serving in Tennessee. I know some of them personally. I know that I would say almost all of our elected officials get into this work because they want to do right by their communities. And we want to enable those great lawmakers to do the work that we believe, like you, they really want to do. And part of that has to do with broadening the primary base for voting.
Well, you just did a perfect segue into the next topic that I want to ask you about, especially with your legal background. And we spoke about this the other day on the phone. Primary voting. That's a big issue in Tennessee. It's a very convoluted wording of the law. There are a lot of people who want to vote in a primary who don't know if they should vote in a primary. I had an elected representative refer to me as a felon because I voted in a Republican primary 2 years ago. I wasn't ever charged, but he continued to refer to me as a felon because I just had the gall to vote in a Republican primary when I wasn't a bona fide Republican as the law reads. So as an attorney with a legal background, when you read the primary or the open primary law, I don't even know how to word this. Like, what red flags pop up to you when you read the wording of this law?
Well, so the law that you're talking about, and I'm actually going to pull up my screen because I want to make sure that I am getting this completely correct. So the law that you're referring to is obviously the law in Tennessee regarding primary voting.
Yes.
And I am pulling it up right now because I want to make sure that I get this correct. So what we're talking about here is Tennessee Code Annotated Section 2-7-115 B and C, which says to vote in a party's primary election, a person must be a, quote, bona fide member of and affiliated with that party, or, quote, declare allegiance to that party. The issue that I think you're describing is that the law does not define what it means to be a bona fide member of and affiliated with. And so, again, it's hard to comply with a law that has vagueness within it, because when you don't know what it means to be a bona fide member of a party and affiliated with, sometimes that can feel overwhelming. And there's a vagueness there that is, it's not defined. Flip side to that coin, and I think what we as a group hope to be able to share with Tennesseans over the next few weeks as we lead up to the primary, what this really means, and I'm not giving legal advice here. This is just, the basic understanding of the law. What it means is that when you go to cast your ballot, whether that's on August 1st, because you're voting in person on election day, whether it's voting early, whether it's requesting a mail-in ballot, all of which are opportunities for you to vote in the primary. When you pull that ballot, when you go, I'm going to give an example of when you actually go on August 1st. You go in, you go to your local elementary school, whatever your polling place is, and you walk in, and there's usually some really nice folks who are poll workers, and they say, do you want the Republican ballot or the Democratic ballot, right? Which party primary do you want to vote in? And of course, everybody should be voting on August 1st, regardless of whether there's a contested primary for your party, because you have local elections going on. So you walk in, and they say, do you want the Republican ballot or the Democratic ballot? Okay. You answer that question with the party I would submit that you feel at that moment you are a bona fide member of and affiliated with. And I think that's your good faith based decision making. That's internal. That's up to you. The state hasn't set forth criteria for what that means. So you decide what that means. What does that mean to you? And I think the question is, when you go and pull the ballot in that moment, do you feel the most bona fide and aligned with the Democratic Party or the Republican Party? And you pull the ballot. And listen, you may not feel the most aligned with the party that you chose on August 1st, the next round of primaries. Even if we had even a closed primary state, you are allowed to change your affiliation. You just have to officially do so. So whether you're an open primary or closed primary, and the only difference is in a closed primary, you have to register. Everybody, it drives me nuts when people are like, I'm a registered, such and such in Tennessee. I'm like, no one is. We're all just registered voters. And that gives us an opportunity to, when we choose to vote in a primary, we vote for the party that we feel the most bona fide and affiliated with. And I think that's a decision that isn't within each of us. And I think it's super important for people also to know, do not be intimidated. Do not be intimidated by this process. Do not be dissuaded, because you may say, well, hell, Chloe, I don't feel like I'm a bona fide affiliated member of anything. I don't like anybody. Well, that's fine. But it's critically important to vote. It's critically important to vote in the primaries. You're not suggesting that you believe every last tenet and, that you're just wedded to the agenda of one party or the other when you pull that ballot. But what you are saying is, at the moment that you pull the ballot, you're pulling the ballot for the party that you do feel the most affiliated with and that you were a member of at that time. And that's an internal decision that is based on, your feeling at the moment for whatever reason. And it could change. And I think people also need to know, look, you could pull a Democratic ballot at the primary, and that does not mean you have to vote for Democrats in the general.
Right.
No one ever knows who you vote for.
Yeah.
They just know whether you vote.
If there was less ambiguity around the wording of this law, and of course, Tennessee is the only state we had it posted at polling sites this last time. Or you were like, that was so. Then people show up and there's this sign and it's not clear. They're like, I don't want to risk it. Okay, for a primary vote, I don't want to risk being prosecuted. But if the wording was clear, or even like you said on the phone the other day, if we just closed them and everybody at least knew, okay, this is the process. Do you think that would naturally start to maybe pull some things back to the middle if we had more primary voting participation?
100%. If we had more primary voting participation, inevitably, I think it would pull things back to the middle for all the reasons I just described, because it would shift the incentive structure. Lawmakers would feel empowered to move to the middle because the middle moved to them, right? I mean, it's just a law of the universe. Every action has a reaction. I think increasing voter turnout in the primary, and it's incredibly important too in a state like ours where the competition in the general is so limited. If we were in a state where you had robust competition at the general election level, perhaps it wouldn't be so critically important. But primaries are where the competition is in Tennessee. So creating and embracing and diversifying the group of people who vote in primaries is just critically important. And listen, I don't know the structural solution. I don't know whether it's less ambiguity in the language around open primaries, whether it's closing primaries, whether there's so many opportunities there to make the primary voting system more efficient. What we do know is that we have a primary coming up in less than a month. What we do know is what the law says right now. And that what we do know is that Tennesseans are craving, I believe, a more reasonable, thoughtful approach to governing that's reflective of their own lives and the complexity that they navigate every day. And so, in order to achieve that goal, I think we need to increase that participation at the primary. And I think, it is intimidating. I've talked to so many of my friends and family and so many folks across the state who have said, I've never really voted in a primary because, quite frankly, I just didn't really know how it all worked. And I get it. I mean, but I think that demystifying the process is so important that I would love if the legislature would create language that helped give us a better understanding of what it means to be a bona fide member and affiliated with. But in the absence of that, I think it's very reasonable, just on a human level, reading that law to say, hey, it's whether you're a bona fide member and affiliated with seems to me like it's a pretty subjective evaluation. There's no objective way to measure it. So it's subjective. It's what you think at that time.
And that's what I always argued whenever I was sort of in the crosshairs of all of this in 2022. I was like, there's no teeth to this. Like how are you going to prove this if you were to prosecute me? I said that verbally. I just don't understand how this could hold up in any kind of prosecution. So I just went ahead and did it. And I'm going to do it again because, we have a very important House district race in the primary, and there's no Democratic challenger waiting on the other side. So this is the primary is the general election. So whoever wins the primary is just going to go step right into that seat, and it's a pretty important election. So I'm going to do it again, and we'll just see what happens. But I do believe there are a lot of people who won't touch it because of their uncertainty of what could happen, and it's just not worth the risk for them. I want to ask you something else real quick, and I can't think of the specific names of the candidates who are running, but I do know across the state there have been people who have never politically been involved before, but a couple of things happened. You had the Dobbs decision, and you had the Covenant shooting. Okay, so two very, very polarizing topics that were involved in both of those situations: abortion and I'm going to use the phrase gun control, but that's such a hyper polarizing word too. So when you say gun control, people all of a sudden just freeze up. But there have been people, because of those two situations, who have chosen to enter this political arena and run for either a House rep, a state Senate position. Has your organization been in contact with them at all? I know you said you're not meeting with like sitting lawmakers, but candidates who may have entered this political fray because of personal situations that mean a lot to them based around those two subjects?
This cycle, our organization is operating our C4 entity and a super PAC. So, as a super PAC, we are supporting candidates and campaigns via independent expenditures. So, we're not making direct contributions to any candidate or campaign. We are supporting them through independent expenditures only. So, in order to comply with the law around super PACs, we limit our contact with candidates and campaigns just to ensure that there's no collaboration between the two. So we have not engaged directly with as many candidates that I expect we will in the future. So in the future, in 2025, after we get through this election cycle, God willing, and we all come out on the other side of this, that's when we really want to start utilizing our hard money PAC, which is a different entity that does allow to engage directly with candidates and campaigns to start to work with community members to recruit great candidates, to support them financially, to support them in other ways. And, I think that we have seen, and I'm just going to say it out loud because I think it's important. We've seen so many incredible women step up to the plate in politics over the last couple of years on both sides, on all sides of this issue, of any issue. And I think it's to be commended, it's to be supported. I can't, my favorite one of my favorite quotes, and I'll get it wrong, was when, someone asked Ruth Bader Ginsburg how many women on the Supreme Court she'd eventually like to see, something along those lines. She said nine. And I'm misquoting that. That was the spirit of the quote. But I think that more women in leadership, um, more people of color, more people from diverse backgrounds who have lived experiences that are different from one another is so important to a functional democracy. But it needs to happen in a atmosphere where you can really avail yourselves of the wonderful things about having that robust group of lawmakers, right? So that's sort of where we come in, is working to reframe the conversations and systemically change the foundation so that folks who are coming in, who have deep personal connections to a variety of issues, show up to a place where they can be their most successful, where they can work and find that common ground. And so, I hope that in the future that our organization is, and we are designed to be very supportive of candidates after we get through this election cycle, and really work directly with folks who have personal connections, to all manner of issues that led them to serve, because I think that's critically important. And I really do personally want to support more women in politics. We don't have enough at all, especially in this state. And I think women in particular are really capable at balancing the complexities of life. Um, we make wonderful leaders, and thoughtful, empathetic, you know, like thoughtful, empathetic individuals are what we need in office. And so I am thrilled to see so many women running from both parties, from third parties. I am thrilled to see women involved in the conversations. It's tough. Women in politics, I mean, it's hard. It's really hard. The scrutiny and the constant critique of everything you do is certainly a challenge. But man, I'm so impressed by the women that we've seen step up to the plate in Tennessee in particular. And I hope we see more of it.
That is something that I've noticed as well, that even as I personally don't care for the super majority that we have right now in Tennessee, and some of the legislation that's being passed because of that, it has, I think, allowed women, like you mentioned before, to sort of get the spotlight put on them when they're fighting back against this, because people are watching Tennessee. I mean, people around the country are watching us. Like we are, for better or for worse, sort of I think a cautionary tale of what happens when you get one party that has such a supermajority in a state. But it's been great for me as sort of someone from the outside watching this, see how many women have stepped up to sort of push back against this a little bit, and do so in a way that's, like you said, empathetic. They're coming from just their own personal experience of why some of this legislation has been poorly drafted, how it does have a real life effect on people. And like we start out this conversation talking about women's health care, abortion. When you draft laws, when legislators draft laws that are so ambiguous or poorly worded that healthcare providers, women themselves, primary voters to a lesser extent, are all confused on the way this reads. And obviously those two situations are, apples and oranges to compare. But when there's ambiguity and when there are these sort of broadly worded pieces of legislation that are out there, they can have incredibly negative real life consequences on people. And in the case of healthcare, it could literally be life or death. So I really appreciate the work that you and your organization are doing, because we've got to find a way to start to bring this back to the middle. Because if we don't, in the end, I think any human being that's part of a political party that has as much power as, well, right now it's Republicans, in 20 years it could be the Democrats. I don't think either way is good. You don't want to have a supermajority of anything, in my opinion. Um, I think people can let power go to their head. And when there's no accountability and there's no competition, they're just going to keep doing what they do. So I really appreciate the work that you guys are doing. Is there anything else? Well, tell everybody how they can get involved with the Best of Tennessee.
Yeah, thank you. I think, first of all, I just want to say all eyes are on Tennessee right now. And as a fifth generation Tennessean, as someone who cares very deeply about this state, I was very happy being a lawyer. I dare to say I was pretty darn good at it, Gabe. I enjoyed it. I was successful. And I chose to do this because this place really matters to me. The loves of my life, my identical twin nephews turned 8 years old yesterday. My family all still lives here in the Knoxville area. And I believe that Tennessee, given our sort of political DNA and what we have seen over when you go way back and you look at some of the tremendous lawmakers that have emerged from Tennessee, really functional, pragmatic, strong leaders from both parties, we are a particularly well-suited place for a project like ours that says, look, we really are not talking about extreme policy. We're talking about extreme approaches to government. We're talking about bringing things back to center. We're talking about thoughtfulness and leadership. And we think that we can start to create a better environment from the center. Wouldn't it be amazing for Tennessee to lead the rest of the country in showing what we can do, in being on the cutting edge of an innovative, challenging approach to solving a very, entrenched political problem that the whole country is facing? And so for me, I'm so excited. Our group is so excited. Our team, we have this incredible bipartisan board of directors from across the state. We really believe in this project, and we believe in Tennessee. We believe in Tennesseans. And I don't say that as like woo woo cheesy. I say that to be dead serious. Like, if there's a state in the country that can pull itself out of the hell it's in, I believe it's Tennessee. And I welcome the opportunity to show the rest of the country what can happen when smart, capable people who may not agree on everything get together and find a way to get more common ground, I think is really important. So to learn more about our organization, you can visit our website. It's bestoftn.us. You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook, Best of Tennessee. We have a great FAQ section on our website where folks can go and get more information about the primary voting process. When is early voting? Where do I go to early vote? What if I want to vote on election day? How do I qualify for a mail-in ballot? When do I have to mail that in? All of that information is easily accessible. We also have on our website, if it's not up already, it will be within the next few days. You will be able to go to our website and find your district using a tool on the Tennessee General Assembly website. We will also have every single contested primary listed on our website. And you can go, and if there's one in your district that you're interested in, you have links to go directly to that candidate's campaign website. So you can start getting information and evaluating who you may want to vote for on August 1st. So that is how you can find out more about us. And again, I think, we're not a policy-based organization. We're not here to promote a viewpoint on any issue related to policy. We're really here to exist to increase that competition, embrace the complexity, shift those incentive structures, and over time create a more functional government that is open to and embracing of common ground and collaboration.
Very good. Thank you so much for taking an hour to talk about the best of Tennessee. Thank you for the work you're doing. I'm a firm believer that government must be representative, and what that means is I think we're a diverse population. I think our state legislators should reflect that, and maybe we're on the way. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing. The best of Tennessee is doing. Chloe Akers, thank you so much.
Thank you.